Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. If Donald Trump is in trouble, it's usually because of a story broken by Washington Post national reporter David Fahrenthold, who joins us now. David, welcome to First Look.
Thanks for having me.
All right. You broke the story that the Manhattan District Attorney has convened a grand jury and is looking into business practices by the former president and his companies before he was president. What signal does this send about how far along the investigation is?
It's a pretty important signal. What it shows is that the DA, who's been investigating Trump since 2018, has sort of ended, or at least reached close to the end of the evidence gathering phase, and he's moved into a phase where he's actually going to start marshaling that evidence to make a case. He thinks he has enough to make some kind of criminal case against somebody. We don't know if it's Donald Trump or his company or somebody else in the Trump orbit, but he's going to go before a grand jury and start presenting them evidence, witnesses, with the goal of proving to that jury that there was reasonable cause to believe a crime was committed by somebody or somebodies. So it shows you that he thinks he's got something in hand that he can make that case with.
So, David, specifically, what is the Manhattan DA looking at? What's the case?
Well, it started out with Stormy Daniels. It started out with the question of whether Trump had broken the law and the payments that were made to the hush money payments made to her in 2016 and the way that those payments were later accounted for internally at the Trump organization. But it's now expanded to become kind of everything. So the DA asked for, I think, 8 years of Trump's tax returns and all the financial documents that go with them. So he finally got that in February 2021. It's millions of pages. This is by far the most that any investigator has ever seen inside Donald Trump's finances. So, that's the power of the DA. Whatever he finds in there, he can make charges out of. What we know from other things that he's done, other subpoenas he's sent out, he's interested in whether Trump inflated the values of his properties to fool his lenders, basically to get better loans because he looked like a better credit risk than he was, or whether he manipulated the values of his properties to get to lower his taxes by claiming conservation easements that were bigger than they should have been, or by lowering the value of his buildings. So it would take a lot to show that somebody violated those sort of tax and relationships with lenders in a way that was big enough to prove criminal charges. But if anybody's going to prove it, it's Vance, who has this voluminous amount of evidence inside Trump's very secretive company.
One of the famous sayings, particularly when I was at the Daily News in New York, is that prosecutors can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. It's that easy. That being said, it's very difficult to predict what grand juries may or may not do. But do you have any reporting about the timetable for action that we might see? And also, just because there's a grand jury doesn't automatically mean there will be indictments, right?
That's right. There could be no indictments, or there could be indictments of somebody you've never heard of, or somebody that's, a low-level person in the Trump organization. What we know about this grand jury is it has a longer timeline than most New York grand juries, which is 6 months. They're going to meet 3 days a week for 6 months. They're probably not going to only hear the Trump organization case. They may hear cases, somebody else may come before them, present a case, get an indictment, go away, and they're back to the Trump organization. And they could be extended. But listen, there's two factors that make me think we're going to get some decision on this by the end of the year. One, the original term of this grand jury runs out in around November. And second, Cy Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney, is not running for re-election this year, meaning he leaves his office at the end of 2021. I have to think that he, after having put so many years of effort into this, at the end of his career, is going to want to be the one that makes a decision, indict or don't indict.
A person can be indicted, but can an organization or a company or a foundation be indicted?
A company can, and that's one of the things we're looking for here is, that would be a way, if Vance can't prove that Trump had any sort of, one of the key parts for him in proving a criminal case against Trump, if he tries, is to prove intent. How can he prove that Donald Trump knew what he was doing was wrong and that he did it anyway? Trump doesn't use email, which is sort of the easy way a lot of executives trip themselves up. So he'd have to use other documents, handwritten notes, testimony from witnesses to prove that. If he can just prove that the company did something wrong and he can't figure out what person pulled the lever, yes, you could indict the Trump organization or one of Trump's many, many LLCs. In practice, I don't think that would have a huge amount of impact for Donald Trump. He could just sort of sacrifice that LLC and move on. But that is an option available to Vance.
Does being a former president give Donald Trump any kind of legal cover, especially if it's related to activities allegedly, excuse me, allegedly committed or occurred before he took office?
No, it doesn't give him any legal cover. Trump tried to claim when he was president that it gave him some legal cover then, but now that he's out of office, there's no legal cover. Obviously, there's some important political leverage that comes with this, though. And I think earlier you mentioned sort of the old saying that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. In this case, I just looking in from the outside, I don't think that Vance would bring a ham sandwich case against Donald Trump. This is somebody who has an enormous amount of political leverage, who may run for president again. There's a huge political, reputational, legal downside to taking him on with a weak case. So I would imagine that Vance is not going to take on Trump, try to indict Trump, unless he thinks he has a case that will definitely work.
Donald Trump's longtime and now one-time lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, seems to be a central figure in this investigation. Explain his significance to this case.
That's one thing that's so striking about this investigation, the DA's investigation, and the New York Attorney General's investigation. It all goes back to Michael Cohen, which means it all goes back to Stormy Daniels. If there wasn't a threat from Stormy Daniels to tell her story before the end of the 2016 election, there wouldn't have been a payoff to Stormy Daniels. And if there wasn't a payoff to Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen wouldn't have gone down in federal court for making that payoff. So Michael Cohen, after pleading guilty to a number of crimes, lying to Congress, breaking campaign finance laws, some of which related to Stormy Daniels, Cohen turns on Trump, and instead of being the sort of chief keeper of Trump's secrets, becomes the chief spiller of Trump's secrets. And the things he talks about in court, when he talks about how he arranged this payoff for Stormy Daniels, that inspires the Manhattan DA's investigation, which grew to be much bigger than that. The things he tells Congress a few months later about how Trump allegedly, inflated the values of his assets, misled lenders and taxing authorities, that inspires the New York AG's investigation. So we wouldn't really be here if it wasn't for Michael Cohen, which means, again, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Stormy Daniels.
And as you said, Michael Cohen was a, quote, keeper of secrets. Now it appears that the keeper of secrets is Alan Weisselberg. What's the criminal exposure of Alan Weisselberg, who is the longtime CFO of the Trump Organization?
That's a great question. Certainly, we know Alan Weisselberg knows pretty much everything there is to know about the Trump Organization. He was basically involved in the movement of every dollar, not just through the company, but also through Trump's private finances, through Trump's charity, the Trump Foundation, even through Trump's inaugural committee. There's been new evidence that Trump had Alan Weisselberg, who had no formal role at the inaugural committee in 2017, review the inaugural committee's finances. He knows everything. He saw everything. And so what I think the DA is hoping to do is to find some criminal exposure for Alan Weisselberg in the hopes that he will turn state's evidence, that Alan Weisselberg will lower his own criminal risk by agreeing to testify against Donald Trump. We don't know what that risk is for Alan Weisselberg exactly. There's been some allegations that Weisselberg got some benefits, like a free apartment, or his son got a free apartment from the Trump Organization. And there's questions about whether he paid income taxes on those things. Other than the DA is focusing on Alan Weisselberg, we don't know quite what they have against him.
Anybody else in the Trump orbit who may be facing criminal charges from this probe?
Well, when we look at the New York AG's investigation, so she's running a civil or mostly civil investigation that sort of tracks over a lot of the same ground as the Manhattan DA. And we know more about the New York AG's investigation because she's had some more public filings about it. The one other sort of Trump executive who's been mentioned by name, whose decisions have been questioned, is Eric Trump, the president's middle son, who is sort of he is an executive vice president of the Trump Organization. He led it effectively while his father was president. He was involved in transactions at a place called Seven Springs, this estate that Trump owns in Westchester County, New York, where Trump, it actually used to belong to Eugene Meyer, one of the owners of the Washington Post. Oh, yeah. Trump came into it later, and then Trump basically got a conservation easement where he said, I'm going to give up my right to develop this property, but in exchange for the value that I've given up, I want a big tax break. And he claimed a $21 million tax break in 2015. The AG has questioned, and I think the DA has also questioned, whether basically Trump inflated the possible development value in order to inflate the value of that tax break. And Eric Trump was right in the middle of that, from things we've seen in court filings, talking to assessors, talking to lawyers, trying to drive that assessment up to drive up the value of the tax break.
That sounds very familiar, because I think Michael Cohen testified to that maneuver before Congress a while back. David Fahrenthold, thank you very much. We are actually, we've gone overtime, but this was great. Thank you very much for coming to First Look. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Right. let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my Washington Post opinions colleagues, Eugene Robinson and George Will. Welcome back to First Look.
Glad to be
Thanks,
with
Jonathan.
you.
Good to be here.
Okay, before we get into all the machinations happening on Capitol Hill, we've got to talk about what happened last night at a rally. Congressman Matt Gaetz railed against what he called, quote unquote, the internet's hall monitors in Silicon Valley. And then he said this, quote, Silicon Valley can't cancel this movement or this rally or this congressman. We have a Second Amendment in this country, and I think we have an obligation to use it. I'm quoting it to you. It is on video. If you have not seen it, those of you who are watching, Google it. George Will, I will start with you. How dangerous is talk like that, especially coming 4 months after the insurrection?
It's dangerous to the extent that it is taken seriously by a critical mass of people who are working themselves up to a frenzy, as they were around noon on the 6th of January in downtown Washington. There are 330 million people in this country, and a few of them are stark raving mad, and unfortunately, a few of them are in Congress. But I wouldn't credit Mr. Gaetz with the ability to bring about an insurrection. He's no Donald Trump. He's a kind of blowhard. Painful to see in a national legislature, but I think establishing causation between what someone like that says and what similarly deranged people do is pretty difficult.
I mean, Gene, I hear what George is saying, and I get it rationally, but there's some crazy people out there, and we all didn't think that that there would ever be an insurrection on the U.S. Capitol until there was. Your reaction to what Congressman Gaetz said?
Well, I do think it's dangerous, Jonathan, but I think Matt Gaetz really ought to be more worrying about his own legal jeopardy and the possibility that he's going to face criminal charges for sex trafficking of a minor or something like that, given that his good friend has turned state's evidence in that case. So I think that's what really ought to be weighing on Matt Gaetz's mind right now, and he's not Donald Trump, as George said. So it's not as if there's going to be this huge popular movement to save him from that potential fate.
All right, let's turn our attention to what folks hoped would be a bipartisan commission to look into the January 6th insurrection. George, the bill easily passed the House, but now it's still, to this day, I'm looking at the TV right now, they are still in the Senate. They haven't even gotten to debating the bill in the Senate. And there are still a lot of Republicans who are against it, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is lining up votes against it, asking Republican members on the fence to do him a personal favor by voting against it. What is going on here?
A number of episodes in American history that can be explained by the words you just used. The bill has passed the House, but the Senate, of course, is where they go to die. I think Mr. McConnell is worried that this will be protracted, time to release in the midst of the 2022 campaigns, and that it will not be meaningfully bipartisan. I think it should certainly be possible to split the differences on these, set some kind of deadline, make sure that the composition is like the Senate itself, split straight down the middle, and get on with it. The Washington and American life in general is much improved by deadlines. They are man's best friend, not the dog. The deadline is. And to get the committee and give it'll have subpoena power. I, for one, can hardly wait to hear Kevin McCarthy testifying about his change that day during the riot with the President of the United States. So I think this will happen, but I don't think the Republicans are being foolish in saying that they have some tweaks they'd like to this.
Gene, your reaction to that, but also, do you think, I mean, George is optimistic. He thinks that this is going to pass, but that's going to require 10 Republicans to come forward and vote for it. We've got Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney, the two senators, said they'll support it. Senator Susan Collins is circulating an amendment that could possibly bring in Senator Cassidy, but if you count those names on, one hand. That doesn't get you to 10.
No, that gets you to 4, and I don't think you get to 10. The Republicans have moved the goalposts on this commission from the beginning, and the Democrats have essentially agreed to everything they wanted. They haven't agreed to the deadline, and I as a fellow columnist, I also believe deadlines are our friends, so I wouldn't have a problem with the deadline. But that's just the latest in a series of demands that the Republicans have made and that the Democrats have accommodated. So it's they just don't want to do this. I mean, and they don't want this commission to look into what happened on January 6th because it's going to be about Donald Trump, and it's going to make him mad. And there's no telling how he might disrupt their prospects for winning back control of one or both houses of Congress in the midterms next year. And I think that matters a lot more than any of the details of exactly how this is done. And the fact that Mitch McConnell is whipping against this measure just really says a lot about the current state of the Republican Party. This should be non-controversial, and it is being whipped by McConnell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to my mind, this should be a 100-0 vote in favor of the commission. George, you said on ABC last week, that you want January 6th, quote, burned into the American mind as firmly as 9/11. Is that possible without a 9/11 style, excuse me, a 9/11 style bipartisan commission?
I think the commission would help. Let me be clear about what I meant by that. I'm not in any way saying that an episode that A, killed 3,000 people and B, propelled us into 2 wars is comparable to this ruckus on Capitol Hill. I think it is of constitutional importance because we've never had Capitol assaulted at the urging of a president to disrupt a constitutional process and actually succeeded in doing so. So it seems to me that what the founders worried about, they were great students of ancient political philosophy. The founders worried what the ancients worried about, which are mobs. And we had a mob at the constant threat in democratic politics, in popular government, is that opinion is not moderated, it is not filtered, it is not refined, it is immediately translated into mob action. Well, there we saw it, the classic anxiety about democracy for 2,500 years. So that's the sense in which I think this bears the kind of scrutiny that would, as you suggest, help brand this episode in the American mind as something that could happen here and should never be allowed to happen again.
Let's turn our attention to to police reform and the efforts to get the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed. Yet another bill that passed the House easily and is now it's not bogged down in the Senate because there are intense negotiations going on between Senators Cory Booker and Tim Scott, and also Congresswoman Karen Bass from the House, who was the lead sponsor and author of the bill in the House. Rather extraordinary that a member of the House is actively involved in negotiations in the Senate. But Gene, do you think that they will be able to hammer out a compromise?
Well, Jonathan, look, can I first just one more quick
Sure.
comment about the commission, which is George's explanation about the mob. Coming from George, one of the principled conservatives I most respect in the world because of his intellectual integrity, even though I disagree with him on many things. That explains why today's Republican Party is not a conservative party at all. It simply cannot be. These Republicans cannot be described as conservatives. That was an eloquent explanation of how a conservative would see what happened on January 6th, and that's not the way these Republicans see it. Onto police reform. I'm fairly optimistic about it, just because Senators Scott and Booker seem optimistic about it, and my guess is that the Republican caucus will go along with whatever Tim Scott agrees to in the end. I think the feeling is that, I mean, if they don't, they've really they've really sort of disrespected in a massive and unfixable way the lone black Republican senator on an issue involving racial justice, and I just don't think they want to do that. I think they've decided they want to go with what he agrees to, and it just really sounds as if he and Senator Booker and Congresswoman Bass want to make a deal, and so I think they might actually get there.
George and Jane, I want to get your reaction to what James Carville wrote in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, calling on Democrats to blame Donald Trump for the rise in violent crime. There have been stories about spikes in violent crime across the country. Here's what he wrote, quote, "Mr. Trump presided over the greatest crime rise in modern American history. Now it's time for the Democratic consulting class to stop its bedwetting on this issue and take this case to the American people. A lawless president created the perfect storm for the crime crisis America now faces." He goes on to write, "Corruption became the administration's oxygen, and Mr. Trump's stunning display of lawlessness set an example for criminals to crawl out of the shadows and believe they would never be brought to justice." I mean, that's just a part of this rather incredible op-ed from James Carville. George Will, you go first. What do you make of that case that Democrats should blame Donald Trump for the rise in crime in the country?
I think Democrats ought to break the habit of treating Donald Trump like God. That is, as the explanation of absolutely everything that happens in the world. I don't think many rioters said, "Ha, the president set this example. I'm going to end the president," either on the right or on the left. Police reform is A, too important, B, too possible now, because one of the good fallout from the current preoccupation with police practices is we've learned a lot about de-escalation training for when there are confrontations between police and the public. We've learned that body cameras really do work. Most of all, if I could deliver a 30-second editorial here, the most important thing that could be done in the way of police reform is to undo a 1982 Supreme Court ruling that established, firmly embedded, what's called qualified immunity, under which, almost no matter how egregious the violation of a citizen's constitutional rights are by a police officer, the police officer is immune from liability for that behavior unless there has been a clearly established law. That's the three-word phrase the court used. And a clearly established law means that there has to have been an episode almost factually identical. I'll give you just one example, then I'll stop my editorial here. A police officer who was trying to shoot a dog, which, by the way, was menacing nobody, instead shot a 10-year-old. When the family sought to sue for liability here, they found out qualified immunity meant they couldn't, because there'd never been an exact replica of this episode. Policeman trying to shoot dog shoots child instead. This can be done. The court ought to have corrected this a long time ago. If it won't, Congress should.
You know, Gene, I want you to jump in, but that very example you used, George, is what Congresswoman Karen Bass used when I talked to her on Tuesday as an example of why qualified immunity must be done away with. Gene.
Yeah, now George, you and George are both absolutely right on qualified immunity, and it is shocking and should be corrected and done away with. And you know, as I also agree with George about ascribing superpower to you know, a one-term disgraced former president who's you know, stewing in his den in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, let him stew. He's not responsible for everything. And just specifically on crime rates, there have been many studies and books and reams and reams of paper devoted to trying to understand why crime rates have risen and fallen, and none of it has been dispositive. None of it has to my reading, at least, has really proved why. I mean, you know, the crime soared in the late '80s and '90s, and then it fell off a cliff and reached modern lows, and so now it's increased a bit, but still not to the bad old days levels, not anywhere near that. And so it is demographics. Is it you know, some societal mega trends that that we're not properly attuned to? I'm not sure, but I am sure that it's you know, despite, I mean, Carville is a gifted political spin meister, but I don't think he can prove that it's Donald Trump's fault.
The best
And I just want to
the best prediction of whether a crime wave is going to come or recede is the number of young males in the population age 18 to 24. Crime will track that remarkably. However, we do know that policing that can locate the very small hotspots where crimes in major cities occur, policing can have a big effect also.
And I just want to be clear that the rise in crime is in violent crime. Not all crimes, but violent crime. George, this is my first time seeing you since you celebrated a big birthday. So belated happy birthday. So I'm giving you the last question, and it's about a column that you wrote, and a recent column that you wrote, where you say that President Biden, you're accusing President Biden of advocating policies that favor the wealthy.
That redistribute wealth? Yes, well, I'll give you 3 examples. If you cancel student debt, you are canceling debts of the minority of Americans who have achieved the rung on the ladder of upward mobility of going to college, and whose lifetime earnings are going to be higher than those of the 2/3 approximately of the country that will not have this benefit. Second example, some Democrats representing affluent inner suburbs and cities want to remove the cap on the deductibility of state and local taxes. We know exactly where the benefit of that goes. It's no mystery. It goes to the top 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% of American earners. Third, we have this lunatic policy of providing up to $7,500 to, and we know who cashes in on it, the IRS data is clear, to people who buy electric automobiles. 3 examples of policies that unambiguously transfer wealth upward.
Okay, and we are exactly out of time. Unless Gene, do you have a real quick response? Real quick.
I will disagree with George on the electric car. I think that is a valuable tax break because it aids in the transition toward a clean energy future, which we have to make. Was the transition we have to make. I say that as a person who has 2 vehicles, one fully electric and one a plug-in hybrid.
Okay, I'm gonna have to call Eugene to find out about this fully electric car stuff. But George Will, Eugene Robinson, as always, we are now over time. But thank you very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you very much.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. Please tune in on Tuesday at 12:30 Eastern, when my colleague Tracy Jan talks with Mary Elliott and Paul Gardulo, both from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as they discuss the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then join me on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern for The Sunday Show on MSNBC. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Thank you for tuning in to First Look on Washington Post Live.